Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're going to look at a genuinely fascinating, honestly almost bizarre disconnect happening right now in the Irish economy. It's this phenomenon that practically everyone feels, right? Yet it rarely makes the headline macroeconomic reports. Today we're unpacking the reality of what happens when an economy just shines on paper but feels incredibly stressful in practice. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this. On paper, by pretty much all traditional metrics, the official story of Ireland looks like a massive success. I mean, employment is incredibly high, growth figures are rock solid, and multinational investment just keeps flowing in. If you're an outsider looking at the data, you'd think, wow, everything is perfect. But if you look at the reality on the ground, people are experiencing tighter budgets, everything is way more expensive, and there's just this heavy cloud of financial uncertainty. It genuinely doesn't feel like a boom. And that massive gap between what the economy says and what people actually feel is exactly what we're going to analyze today. So to understand this massive gap, we need to define exactly what we're dealing with here. We aren't looking at a sudden dramatic market collapse. No, we're looking at what we call a slow economic squeeze. Think of it as a continuous accumulation of small financial pressures. We're talking rising costs, stagnating real incomes, and a shrinking capacity to actually save money. Now, none of these things are entirely catastrophic on their own, right? But together, they act like a mechanical vice. Over time, they quietly alter how you live, how you spend, and honestly, how you feel about your financial future.
Now, a squeeze always starts somewhere, and in Ireland, step one is undeniably housing. Supply simply hasn't kept up with demand, so whether you're renting or trying to buy, a massive portion of your income just gets eaten up right out of the gate. Once that happens, your budget is already fragile. Then we hit step two, global energy costs. Ireland relies really heavily on imports, so when global pressures rise, like say disruptions in crucial shipping routes like the Strait of Hormuz, those energy costs absolutely spike locally. And because energy feeds into literally everything we do, we hit step three, the inflation of transport, food, and basic services. The pressure cascades right down to your weekly grocery bill.
Now, you might be sitting there wondering, wait, but aren't wages going up? Well, yes and no. The actual numbers on your paycheck, your nominal wages, might be increasing, sure, but that's happening super unevenly across different sectors. And here's the kicker. When you adjust those paychecks for the rising costs of housing, energy, and food that we just talked about, many people are actually standing perfectly still or even moving backward. To be caught in an economic squeeze, you don't actually need to take a literal pay cut. You just need your income to fall behind the pace of your everyday expenses.
Because of that widening gap between real wages and rising costs, the very first silent victim of a slow squeeze is always savings. People are finding it so much harder to build any sort of financial cushion. And when your savings drop, your behavior changes. You lose that financial buffer, you lose your sense of security, and your flexibility just vanishes. You start hesitating before filling up the car, you think twice about a weekend away, you just become way more cautious. It's subtle at first, but these consistent changes in daily spending slowly start to drag on the wider economy.
And this brilliantly illustrates where this squeeze is actually coming from. It stems from a deep structural imbalance. Right now, there are essentially two completely distinct economies operating inside Ireland. At the top, you've got the multinationals. They're driving high-paying jobs, huge corporate activity, but that wealth, it's highly concentrated in very specific industries and locations. Meanwhile, local businesses are facing a totally different reality. They have to cope with rising wage demands and soaring operating costs, which forces them to either hike up their prices or completely slash their profit margins. It's a fundamental imbalance that puts immense, highly uneven pressure on the everyday economy.
Let's zoom in for a second on what this structural imbalance actually looks like for families in Ireland, especially the younger generations or dual-income households. Just massive slices of their income are taken up immediately by housing, childcare, and basic daily expenses. Then you've got taxes. Remember, as nominal incomes rise, the tax burden often increases right along with it, shrinking the actual benefit of a raise. So what are you left with? Just this tiny sliver for savings. People aren't stressing out because they want absolute luxury. This immense pressure builds just from trying to achieve basic, fundamental stability.
So looking at all this intense local pressure, it begs a really fascinating question. Is this strictly an Irish phenomenon? Like, is Ireland completely unique in experiencing this quiet, grinding disconnect between macroeconomic data and microeconomic reality? Now, what's really interesting about this historical comparison is the answer is no. It's definitely not uniquely Irish. It's actually a mechanical economic pattern that has popped up throughout history.
While modern Ireland has this surface-level stability masking deep cost pressures, economists have noted the exact same phenomenon historically in places like the German colonial possessions. Yeah, it sounds totally unrelated, but even there, economic systems appeared incredibly stable and productive on the surface. But beneath that shiny veneer, underlying logistical, distribution, and cost pressures were quietly and gradually tightening the whole system.
So whether you're looking at modern-day Dublin or historical economies of a completely different scale, the shared mechanisms of a squeeze are literally identical. They always feature this stable surface appearance that hides gradually tightening cost pressures. They're driven by logistical and supply challenges, like the housing crisis in Ireland's case, and they are fundamentally rooted in an uneven distribution of wealth and resources. When costs rise faster than incomes for the average person, the squeeze is inevitable. It really doesn't matter what era we're talking about.
Understanding these mechanics brings us to the ultimate anxiety that is looming over so many people right now. I mean, if the pressure is building, if the savings are shrinking, and if we know this squeeze is a historical pattern, are we looking at an economic crash? Seriously, is Ireland's economy going to suddenly collapse in the next 6 months?
So the crucial point here is no. Based on the data, we are not looking at a sudden cliff-edge crash in the next 6 months. It's not a sudden collapse. It is a grind. It's a slow, ongoing adaptation to persistent financial pressure. The numbers underneath the Irish economy are actually still strong enough to prevent a rapid implosion. But the squeeze means that the daily experience of participating in that economy is just going to continue to feel absolutely exhausting for a lot of people.
Which brings us to the future trajectory. If we aren't crashing, where exactly are we going? Well, the built-in pressure is going to continue. The real danger here is that widespread consumer caution, people pulling back on spending because their budgets are squeezed so tight, will eventually drag down the wider economy. Now, government policy can absolutely influence this through things like housing supply fixes or tax relief, but let's be real. Those levers take a long time to act. Therefore, the current balance between income, cost, and growth remains highly fragile. It's not falling apart today, but man, it is stretched incredibly tight.
I want to leave you with this final, really powerful thought. When an economy tightens slowly, it doesn't always make noise, but it always leaves an impact. A slow squeeze doesn't dominate the breaking news with dramatic stock market crashes. Instead, it quietly reshapes how you plan for your future and exactly how families operate day to day. So, the real question isn't whether the economy is going to crash tomorrow, it's how much tighter can the vice turn before the everyday economy simply stops functioning. Thanks so much for joining us for this explainer, and we will catch you next time.